Hi guys, and welcome to Chapter 4. Chapter 4 is the first in our chapters about each of the micronutrients. So today we're going to cover carbohydrates, which includes starch, sugar, glycogen, and fiber. Carbohydrates. Here are a few definitions for you. It's always good to understand the definitions before we get started on the chapter. I am also known for putting a word bank with some fill in the blanks on exams. So, again, another little hint there. Always good to make sure you understand definitions. The name carbohydrate, if you break it down, means carbon and water. Sometimes in chemistry, you might see the word carbohydrate abbreviated to just CHO, and that is to signify carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, which are the only three elements that make up a carbohydrate. Carbohydrates are composed of sugar or multiple sugars. Within carbohydrates, we have complex carbohydrates, which are long chains of sugar units such as starch or fiber, and these are also called polysaccharides. Simple carbohydrates are sugars, including both single sugar units and, that should say, linked pairs of sugar units. These are either monosaccharides, made up of a single sugar unit, or disaccharides, which are two sugar units linked together. A close look at carbohydrates. So some of this chapter is going to be kind of chemistry focused as we talk about how carbohydrates look as a molecule and how they perform in the body. Some of this might be a little bit of a review for those of you who have had some biology or chemistry courses in the past. So on this slide, we're looking at carbohydrates and their function in photosynthesis. So carbohydrates contain the sun's radiant energy captured in a form that living things can use to drive the processes of life. Water and carbon dioxide combine to yield the most common of the sugars, the single sugar glucose. So the chemical, writing it out as a chemical formula, that would be C6H12O6. That's the chemical formula for glucose. Glucose is the most common simple sugar and probably the one that we will talk about the most. So no matter which carbohydrate we talk about, it will always be CHO. The numbers next to those letters will be the only things that will change. And so an actual diagram of the carbohydrate glucose, the actual diagram of the molecule is at the bottom of the slide there, and you can see that the numbers next to the C, the H, and the O denote the number of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms in that molecule. So that is what a molecule of glucose looks like. The picture on the right, again, depicts photosynthesis. So green plants make carbohydrate through photosynthesis in the presence of chlorophyll and sunlight. In this process, water is absorbed through the plant's roots. These water molecules, obviously water we know is H2O, those water molecules donate the hydrogen and oxygen needed for the glucose molecule. Then the carbon dioxide that plants breathe in from the air donates the carbon and the oxygen to make up a complete glucose unit. So here we're going to talk about monosaccharides and disaccharides. As I said in that first definition slide, monosaccharides are single sugar units and disaccharides are sugar units made up of two sugars. So we have three examples of monosaccharides here at the top. We have fructose, glucose, which we just talked about, and galactose. So fructose is commonly found in fruits. So the sugar that's found in fruits is known as fructose, and galactose is simple sugar that's found in milk and other dairy products. With these three monosaccharides, they're able to be combined to make three different disaccharides. So you'll notice in the disaccharides, there's a unit of glucose in each of them. The first is sucrose, and sucrose is just your typical table sugar, and that is a unit of fructose and a unit of glucose. Next, we have maltose. Maltose is two glucose units linked together. And then finally, we have lactose, which is a disaccharide found in milk. And the lactose is made by linking a single molecule of galactose to a single molecule of glucose. So a little bit more about disaccharides, something that we just covered. All three of those disaccharides, sucrose, maltose, and lactose, all contain glucose. Lactose is a milk sugar, and maltose, if you remember, is made up of those two glucose units. Maltose is something we don't hear about very much, but where you would see that is where starch is being broken down in the body. As I said on the last slide, sucrose is familiar to us as table sugar. It's obtained by refining the juice from sugar beets and sugar cane. However, sucrose can also appear naturally in many fruits and vegetables. Sucrose tastes sweet because it contains the sweetest of the monosaccharides, which is fructose. Again, fructose is typically found in fruits and vegetables. When you eat a food containing monosaccharides, you can absorb them directly into your blood, right? So monosaccharides are those single sugar units. They're very easy to absorb. However, when you eat disaccharides, they must be broken down before they can be absorbed. So those bonds between those two single sugar molecules have to be broken before those single molecules can be absorbed. Enzymes in your intestinal cells are responsible for breaking down disaccharides. These are called carbohydrases. So it's got that prefix in that first part of the word. So we know we're talking about carbohydrates, and that aces suffix is going to let us know that that is an enzyme. So as we talk about fats and proteins, there's going to be other enzymes that are unique to each of those nutrients that allows them to be broken down. So for example, for fats, we're going to have lipases, and for proteins, we're going to have proteases. So that aces suffix, you should get used to seeing that and know that when you do see it, what we're talking about is an enzyme. Blood delivers absorbed monosaccharides to the liver, which then modifies nutrients to make them useful to the body. So what becomes of the monosaccharides once they're absorbed? Glucose is used for energy by all of the body's tissues. So the liver releases that into the bloodstream for delivery to the body. Okay, so once absorbed through the walls of your intestines, that glucose goes right into your bloodstream, which takes the glucose to your liver, and then your liver distributes it out to the rest of your body. Galactose can be converted to glucose by the liver. So once galactose gets to the liver, your liver then turns it into glucose and again sends it out to the rest of your body. Fructose is normally used for fuel by the liver, or it can be broken down into building blocks for fat. or other needed molecules. All right, now we're going to talk about starch. Starch is a polysaccharide. So we talked about monosaccharides being one sugar unit and disaccharides being two. Polysaccharides are another term for complex carbohydrates, and these are compounds composed of long strands of glucose linked together. So instead of just one sugar molecule or two sugar molecules, these are many linked together. Starch is a plant polysaccharide composed of glucose. After cooking, starch is highly digestible by human beings, but raw starch is more difficult to digest. One of the key characteristics to know about starch is that starch is a plant storage form of glucose. Okay, so we're going to talk about the human storage in just a second, but starch is unique in that it's how plants store glucose. So that's important to remember. So now we're going to talk about three different polysaccharides: starch, which we just talked about. Then we're going to talk about glycogen and also fiber. So these three are all considered polysaccharides. So glycogen. Glycogen is a highly branched polysaccharide that's made and stored by liver and muscle tissues of human beings as a storage form of glucose. So, in contrast to starch, which we just talked about, we have starch being a plant's form of storing glucose, and then we have glycogen, which is how humans and other animals store glucose. Glycogen is nearly undetectable in meats because glycogen breaks down rapidly when an animal is slaughtered. There is a slide coming up here in a second that's going to show each of the three polysaccharides, starch, glycogen, and fiber, in more detail and show them on a molecular level that I think will help you to better understand the differences in each of the molecules. Fibers. So again, fiber is the third polysaccharide we're going to talk about. Fiber is the indigestible parts of plant foods, largely non-starch polysaccharides that are not digested by human digestive enzymes. Some can be digested by resident bacteria of the colon, but not many. Fibers include cellulose, hemicelluloses, pectins, and gums. And the fibers of a plant work to form the supporting structures of its leaves, stems, and seeds. Because fiber is responsible for forming the structure of plants, it has to be rigid. Molecules of fiber get their rigidity from the presence of double bonds, which you'll see in the next slide. And so that rigidity is also why fiber is, in most cases, not digested by human enzymes. So here's the slide that you were promised. This is figure 4.3 in your text if you're following along there. So we have the single unit of glucose at the top of the page. And then over to the left, we have an example of starch. And you'll notice that the starch molecules are many glucose molecules all linked together, and they can be unbranched. So in the picture below, you can see an unbranched starch molecule, just sort of that long squiggly line, or they can be branched, which you see in that picture on the right below the starch molecule. Now you'll notice those branches on the starch molecule are pretty organized. In general, the vast majority of starch molecules are going to be long and straight. There's very few instances when they are branched. Typically, when we think of a branched carbohydrate, polysaccharide, what we're talking about is glycogen. So you can see that on the middle example there, how the glycogen molecules are made up of many glucose units, and these glycogen molecules are very highly branched. So we have the starch molecules that are typically pretty straight in nature, and then we have, in contrast, the glycogen molecules, which are highly branched. Now, the last example here, of course, is fiber. So fiber is very straight and very rigid. And this is because each of those glucose molecules is linked together by a double bond. So that double bond is what gives it its really rigid, straight structure, and makes it difficult for your body to digest. So we have glycogen in the center that's very obviously branched. Then we have starch on the left, that usually exists in, single lines, straighter lines of glucose. These straight lines of starch, though, can be differentiated from fiber because the starch, the rows of glucose in starch are connected by single bonds, whereas the straight chains in fiber are connected by double bonds. So just some really key similarities and differences to note with each of these polysaccharides to help better understand, as we talk about their functions in the body, why they behave the way that they do. The need for carbohydrates. So if I want to lose weight and stay healthy, should I avoid carbohydrates? The quick answer is no. It is best to pay close attention to portion sizes, calorie intake, and to eat a diet that contains carbohydrate-rich whole grains, vegetables, and fruits that supply fiber, other needed nutrients, and beneficial phytochemicals. It is certainly possible to consume more than enough calories from carbohydrates, and when this happens, your body will convert the extra carbohydrates to fat, which then can lead to weight gain. So the key here to nutrient balance is variety and moderation. Just like anything, carbohydrates, when consumed in moderation, are a great part of a healthy diet. As we go through talking about the different macronutrients, we're going to talk about caloric density. So gram for gram, carbohydrates have fewer calories than fat. You'll see later on when we talk about caloric density, carbohydrates and proteins both contain 4 calories for every gram of carbohydrate or protein, whereas fat contains 9 calories for every gram. And then we have alcohol, and alcohol contains 7 calories per gram. So gram for gram, carbohydrates actually contain fewer calories than fat. When people think of carbohydrates and carbohydrates being bad, which of course we know that they're not bad, I think a lot of times what they're thinking about is added sugars. So these are the purified, refined sugars that contain no other nutrients and thus are low in nutrient density. When we say carbohydrates, though, we are not just limiting ourselves to those added sugars, because as we know from above, carbohydrates are also found in things like whole grains, fruits, and vegetables, which are very beneficial and very important to a healthy diet. So carbohydrates in general are not the enemy. Certainly, they do need to still be consumed in moderate amounts, but within carbohydrates, the real danger is over consuming some of those added sugars and more processed carbohydrates. More about the need for carbohydrates. So why do nutrition experts recommend fiber-rich foods? So if you remember from a few slides ago when we were talking about fiber, I mentioned that fiber cannot be easily broken down by a human's digestive enzymes. So if it can't be broken down, then it can't be absorbed through the wall of your small intestine, And if it can't be absorbed through the wall of your small intestine, then it never actually really enters your body. It goes through your digestive system, but it doesn't go anywhere beyond that. So what's the point of fiber, and why should we even bother eating it? Well, even though fiber doesn't actually leave your digestive system, it plays an important role in promoting the normal blood cholesterol concentrations and also helps to reduce a risk of heart and artery disease. Fiber also contributes to the modulation of blood glucose concentration, which can lead to a reduced risk of diabetes. Fiber also regulates the amount of water in your digestive system and the rate at which food moves through your digestive system. So it's very important for maintenance of healthy bowel function and also promotion of a healthy body weight. Purified fibers from supplements fail to provide all of these benefits. So for maximum benefit, you should really try to get fiber from a variety of food sources. So again, things like whole grain and whole fruits and vegetables. All right, so moving on, we're going to dive a little deeper into the different types of fiber. So within fibers, under the umbrella of fiber, we have two different kinds. We have soluble fiber and insoluble fiber. Soluble fiber are food components that readily dissolve in water and often impart gummy or gel-like characteristics to food. These are compounds like pectin. And soluble fiber is most commonly found in oats, barley, legumes, okra, and citrus fruits. Then we have insoluble fiber. So insoluble is the opposite of soluble. We know soluble fiber dissolves in water. Insoluble fiber, in contrast, does not dissolve in water. So insoluble fiber is the tough, fibrous structures of fruits, vegetables, and grains. They are indigestible, and as we said, they do not dissolve in water. Insoluble fiber is found in bran, the strings of celery, and the skins of corn kernels. If you are following along in your text, figure 4-5 shows fiber composition of common foods. So if you're wondering how much fiber you're eating in a day, or maybe if you need to increase your fiber, places to get that, 4-5 in your text is going to be where you'd like to look. How is glucose regulated by the body? When we talk about the storage of glucose by the body, it's hard not to think about what that process looks like for those with diabetes. We're going to talk about that more later this lecture, a bit more in depth. But to start, we're going to just talk about how glucose is regulated by the body. So if your blood sugar gets too high, you can experience confusion or difficulty breathing. In contrast, if your blood sugar gets too low, you can feel dizzy and weak. So to prevent either of these things from happening, your body works to store glucose in the glycogen of your liver and muscles and stores excess glucose in the adipose tissue as fat. Your body also works to replenish diminished blood sugar from glycogen stores. All right, so this diagram is going to give us an idea of the process of restoring blood glucose norm in your body. Blood glucose increases right after you eat a large meal. So the glucose in the food that you eat moves through the liver and into the blood vessels, causing a rise in blood sugar. So we see at the beginning, I'll kind of move my little mouse here. Over here on the left, we have a glucose norm. Then you eat lunch, okay? When you eat lunch, the glucose in your blood increases. So your blood glucose will sort of peak here. Your receptors in your pancreas will say, oh man, we have a really big blood glucose increase. And in response to that increase, your pancreas will trigger the release of insulin. Your liver will kick in. Your liver will recognize that increase in glucose, and then it's going to pick up some of that extra glucose in your blood and convert it to glycogen, which, if you remember, glycogen is how your body stores extra carbohydrate, how it stores extra sugars. So by taking that glucose out of the blood and storing it as glycogen, your liver is able to reduce your blood glucose back to a normal level and save some of that extra glucose for a later time. All right, so let's say you're at a normal glucose and you haven't eaten in a while. You're going to experience a decrease in blood glucose as that glucose gets used up by your body. Again, this is where your pancreas comes in. Receptors in your pancreas recognize that there's been a decrease in blood glucose. Your pancreas receptors then trigger the release of glucagon. Glucagon is going to tell the liver, hey, we don't have enough glucose in the blood, so the liver is going to go to those glycogen stores and release some of that extra glucose that's being stored back into the blood, thus returning your blood to a normal level of blood glucose. So we're going to talk about this process a little bit more in detail. What's important here is to note the role of both your pancreas and your liver and understand the differing roles of insulin and glucagon. We know insulin helps to trigger a reduction in blood glucose back to a norm, whereas glucagon is going to signal an increase in blood glucose back to a norm. All right, so keep that in mind as we go through and talk a little bit more about that process. How is glucose regulated by the body? Insulin is released from your pancreas when blood glucose is high. We saw that in the previous diagram. And then insulin works to facilitate blood glucose uptake by the muscles, liver, and adipose tissue. It also stimulates glycogen synthesis in the liver. So some places where glycogen is in your body is in your muscles, your liver, and your adipose tissue. Adipose tissue is just the fancy scientific term for fat tissue. So this is where glucose is stored as glycogen. When insulin recognizes that your body has high blood sugar, it can also stimulate your liver to create more glycogen. So glycogen is like the little storage units of glucose. So when all of your storage units are full, insulin can trigger your liver to create more of those storage units to pack full of more glucose. In terms of glucose storage in the body, you can see from the graph on the right that about 2/3 of the glucose that's stored as glycogen is stored in your muscle tissue. We have 32% that's stored in the liver, and then about 2% that goes to your brain. So part of this, so your muscles storing glucose. You might not have thought that a lot of glucose is stored in your muscles, but it's actually a very critical fuel for physical activity. So it's important that glucose is available for your muscles to use for work. Your brain feeds off glucose. It stores a very tiny fraction of the total as sort of an emergency reserve to fuel the brain for an hour or two in severe glucose deprivation. Then we have the liver, which stores the remainder so that it's able to release glucose into the bloodstream or send it to the brain or other tissues when supply is low. Without carbohydrate from food to replenish the glycogen stores in the liver, the stores in the liver can be depleted in under a day. So while there is storage space there, it's not unlimited storage. a little bit more about how glucose is regulated by the body. Another hormone, epinephrine. Epinephrine can also be referred to as adrenaline. Epinephrine also triggers the breakdown of liver glycogen as part of the body's defense mechanism to provide extra glucose for quick action in danger. In order to be prepared for emergencies, you should consume carbohydrates regularly and eat meals with starch and soluble fiber combined with some protein and fat to slow digestion so that glucose has time to enter the blood gradually in an ongoing, steady rate. Excess glucose and body fatness. Body fatness can also be referred to as adiposity. Carbohydrates stored as fat or adipose tissue. So the liver possesses enzymes to break extra glucose into smaller molecules, which can then be assembled into durable energy storage compounds or fatty acids. Newly made fatty acids then travel in the blood to the adipose tissues where they are combined into larger fat molecules and stored. So when you're consuming more carbohydrate, more glucose than your body needs, your body then can turn some of that carbohydrate into fat tissue as a means of energy storage. Liver cells only store about 2,000 calories of glycogen, but the fat cells of an average person can store over 70,000 calories of fat. If your body runs out of storage for fatty acids, new fat cells can be created to store the excess. When we talk about fat in this class, fat is a macronutrient. It's essential for a healthy diet. It's essential for your body to function properly. So what most people refer to as fat in their bodies is actually adipose tissue. And when we talk about fat as a nutrient, we're going to be talking about how fat is metabolically active and the roles it plays in the body. This is in contrast to adipose tissue, which itself is not very metabolically active. So when you hear adipose tissue referred to, we are talking about fat tissue, but we are not talking about fat as a nutrient. All right, now we're going to chat a little bit about diabetes. Diabetes are metabolic diseases characterized by elevated blood glucose and inadequate or ineffective insulin, which impair a person's ability to regulate blood glucose. So if you remember from that diagram, as your blood glucose becomes elevated, insulin then triggers the mechanism that brings your blood glucose back down to normal. Without insulin available or not enough insulin, your body has a lot of trouble returning its blood glucose back down to normal. There is a condition known as pre-diabetes, which is when blood glucose levels are higher than normal but not high enough to be diagnosed as diabetes. Pre-diabetes is a major risk factor in diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And pre-diabetes is something that doctors are looking at more and more to help patients really get their blood glucose under control before it escalates to a point where it is full-on diabetes. Here in the United States, diabetes is a leading cause of death. For people with diabetes, they have an increased risk of heart disease, stroke, and their risk, or for people with diabetes, the risk of heart disease, stroke, and dying from those issues on any particular day is doubled. Diabetes is also the leading cause of limb amputations, fatal kidney failure, and permanent blindness. Each year, diabetes costs an estimated $174 billion in U.S. healthcare services, disability, and other costs. I should say, too, certainly in terms of things like amputations and blindness, things like that, diabetes, while it increases your risk for some of those things. It is something that can be, you can treat, and through proper management of your diabetes, as long as you keep your blood glucose in check, your risk for those complications is not as high. Toxicity of excess blood glucose. Chronically elevated blood glucose alters the metabolism in virtually every cell of your body. Chronic inflammation of blood tissues accompanies uncontrolled diabetes, and this is where we can see some eye, kidney, heart, and other associated problems. The structures of the blood vessels and nerves become damaged, which can lead to loss of circulation and nerve function. And so when we have that loss of circulation, if your blood is not able to effectively circulate throughout your body, then the proper amounts of oxygen are not being delivered to your extremities, to your arms and legs. And in instances where diabetes is poorly controlled, that lack of oxygen delivery to your arms and legs is what could potentially lead to an amputation of that limb. More about circulation. The loss of blood flow to the kidneys damages them, often resulting in the need to cleanse the blood by means of kidney dialysis, or in later stages, an individual may need to undergo a kidney transplant. Poor circulation can also increase the likelihood of infections. With loss of both circulation and nerve function, undetected injury and infection may lead to death of tissue, like gangrene, necessitating, as I said before, the amputation of the limbs, and most often we see this in the legs or feet. Prediabetes and the importance of testing. During prediabetes, there may be few or none of the warning signs of diabetes, but tissue damage may already have started and may be progressing silently, leading to type 2 diabetes. Tens of millions of people in the United States have prediabetes, but few are aware of it. This is another reason why it's important to see a doctor on a regular basis, have an annual checkup or a physical. Diagnosis of diabetes or prediabetes can be made using one of several tests, such as a fasting plasma glucose test or HbA1c test, and either of these can be administered by just a general practitioner. Different types of diabetes. We're going to start talking about type 1 diabetes. Type 1 is the type of diabetes in which the pancreas produces no or very little insulin. Type 1 diabetes is often diagnosed in childhood, although some cases may arise in adulthood. Type 1 diabetes is responsible for 5 to 10% of diabetes cases. It is an autoimmune disorder influenced by genetic inheritance. It arises when the person's own immune system misidentifies the protein insulin as an enemy and attacks the cells of the pancreas that produce it. So the word autoimmune, your immune system obviously works to keep out pathogens. So if you have a virus or a bacteria that's not supposed to be in your body, your immune system works to attack that virus or that bacteria and get it out of your body. With an autoimmune disorder, your immune system is working against your own body. So that's where that auto prefix comes in. So in this case, with type 1 diabetes, your immune system is actually recognizing insulin as a problem and attacking the cells in your pancreas that are responsible for creating it. With type 1 diabetes, the pancreas becomes so damaged that it can no longer produce insulin. After each meal, glucose will build up in the blood while body tissues are simultaneously starving for glucose. So even though your blood glucose is going up, because you don't have the pancreas creating insulin, your blood just gets full of glucose, but that glucose is never able to be distributed throughout the body where it's needed. In this instance, the person must receive insulin from an outside source, but because insulin is a protein, it cannot be taken orally or it would become digested. Therefore, insulin must be pumped into the body through a tiny tube under the skin, allowing it to enter your blood but bypass the enzymes in your digestive system. All right, we're going to move on to type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is the type in which the pancreas makes plenty of insulin, but the body's cells resist insulin's action. It's often diagnosed in adulthood and is responsible for 90 to 95% of all diabetes cases. So this is what we typically see in the population. Body tissues lose their sensitivity to insulin, causing blood glucose to climb higher and higher, which then leads to the pancreas compensating by producing larger and larger amounts of insulin. Over time, the cells of the pancreas get tired and will actually reduce their insulin production. Type 2 diabetes we often see associated with obesity. The greater the accumulation of body fat, particularly around the waistline, the more insulin-resistant cells become and the higher blood glucose rises. Aging and genetic inheritance also can increase the risk of type 2 diabetes. One of the best prevention methods to reduce your risk of getting type 2 diabetes is reducing excess body weight. Preventing type 2 diabetes, I just started talking about this. In research, these 5 lifestyle factors consistently and dramatically reduce people's risk of developing diabetes. Number 1, a healthy body weight. Number 2, a nutritious eating pattern. Number 3, regular physical activity. Number 4, moderate alcohol intake for those who drink. And number 5, not smoking. Even people with prediabetes or diabetes can change their fate by losing weight, exercising, choosing a nutritious diet, and if necessary, taking medication. A lot of people do take medication if their diabetes is more advanced and difficult to manage, but there are plenty of ways to reduce your risk and even reverse your diabetes through these 5 lifestyle changes. And that's all we have for today. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me a message or, ask me in the lab. Hopefully, you guys enjoyed that lecture and learned a little bit more about carbohydrates. I'll see you guys later.